Hello and welcome to what is our third conversation for Past Conversations, and I'm absolutely delighted today that we're joined by Luke Daly-Groves. Luke is someone who I would describe as wearing many hats. His range of historical expertise and knowledge is something that definitely makes him stand out from the crowd in terms of both history and academia. So Luke, thank you very much for joining us, and perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself and say hello.
Thanks very much for having me on the programme. It's a really kind introduction. I'm Luke Daly-Groves. I'm a historian, author and lecturer. I'm doing a PhD at the University of Leeds in history, and I teach at both the University of Leeds and the University of Central Lancashire in Preston as well.
Look, one thing that I'm interested to find out about is in terms of how you got to where you are, but in particular about going back to maybe the early days and your memories of studying history at school. What do you remember about that?
So one of my earliest memories of studying history at school was in primary school when we were set sort of homework to learn about ancient Egypt, and particularly to write our own names in hieroglyphics. And I just always remember in class sort of painting these hieroglyphics in a sort of cartouche. And it sort of blew my mind how something so old, thousands of years, could be so sophisticated and so just so incredible to look at. And in school, there was all sorts in primary school, there's all sorts of activities like this. So we had a Victorian day, and in particular, we had an evacuee day, where we had to dress up like evacuees. And I remember that because my granddad gave me his old ration book, which he kept in the loft, and his old sort of gas mask. And that made me draw a link between my own family history and my own family story and the sort of wider history that we were being taught at school. So I had a personal interest there as well. And at the same time, at home, my parents and grandparents were always really sort of encouraging me to read, and I've got some books here to show you from my childhood. So there's this sort of ancient Egypt DK knowledge guide from the 90s, and then Horrible Histories, one about ancient Egypt, which I used to love reading when I was younger. And the sort of interest in Egypt, it was ignited when my grandparents, because they knew I was really interested in it, and I used to want to be an archaeologist at first, actually, and in particular an Egyptologist, and they saved up and took me to Egypt in 2007, and it was just, again, it blew my mind seeing how these ancient and incredible structures, like Tutankhamun's mask, the pyramids, the temples at Luxor, Valley of the Kings, it's just the I don't know. I just found it absolutely incredible. And then by the time I got to secondary school, my interest was well and truly ignited in history. But it really got going with the lessons at high school, because my teachers, and I will shout them out because they're still teaching history, Mr. Hayward, Mr. Shannon, and Mr. Blackburn. Their lessons were the highlight of the week for me at high school, and they were just incredible teachers. And it was really inspiring seeing how much effort they put into the lessons, because you could see it on the screen, on the PowerPoints they used to use, on the handouts, the homework. And the fact that they used to stand there and their knowledge, what they used to call their factual recall, was absolutely incredible. It was just something to inspire to. But in terms of sort of standing out from other lessons at school, the reason I was sort of attracted to history is because in history I was allowed to argue. So I was always a really sort of argumentative teenager, an argumentative child, and this didn't really do me well in other lessons like maths, where less things are questionable. 2 + 2 is 4, and I could be argumentative, but in history it was encouraged. It's like, no, you're allowed to debate, you're allowed to argue, and this really gave me an outlet, which was less of an asset in other areas, but in history it really allowed my sort of personality to flourish.
When I was preparing for this conversation with you and was kind of putting together your biography, so to speak, one of the things that really stood out for me was the diversity in terms of the study that you've done so far. I mean, you really have written about a great deal of history that is incredibly diverse, and to some extent that's perhaps quite unusual. Why is it that your studies of history have been so varied and diverse? Why is that?
So I've always been fascinated by a broad array of topics in history, and I'm yet to discover anything in history which I don't really find interesting. And when I talk about that, a quote comes to mind by a travel writer called Luke Daly-Groves, and he says he sees people walking around museums and they look bored. And the only reason they're bored is that they don't know enough about what they're looking at. Because if you tell them the right facts about these objects, their eyes will light up and they'll go, wow. And that sort of thing is like that with me. To be sort of more specific about it, I've always been particularly fascinated about questions in history which historians haven't been able to answer, questions which they've struggled to answer, mysteries, if you like, and things which seem unsolvable. And so I've sort of made it my mission, if you like, to try and solve these questions, to look at them and to try and answer them, because I think it's important. So it's really an approach about sort of filling gaps in knowledge. And this is how I came on to study Hitler's death in some ways. And when I came to write the sort of thesis on that at university level, because it was my BA Hons thesis, my undergraduate thesis, I was met with resistance in some quarters. People say, you need to specialize, you've got to specialize, you just need to specialize. And I was saying, I don't want to specialize. I don't feel like that. I want to sort of, I don't want to shut myself off to all of the amazing possibilities which the past offers its readers. And so I knew it wasn't usual to be sort of addressing these broad topics right from the start of the BA thesis. But it's fortunate I chose to sort of try and answer the recurring question of the circumstances of Hitler's death, because that introduced me to Hugh Trevor Roper, and he has what he calls a philosophy of history, and I had been unknowingly following this philosophy just through natural habit. And when I discovered that, he actually sort of put into fantastic prose what my approach to the subject, I was relieved. So I've got a quote here to read out for you in his book, Historical Essays, because I want to do it justice. And there's a particular memory. So when I came to do my master's studies, with this reluctance to specialise, I said, I'm going to study Napoleon I and Napoleon III in the Victorian attitudes towards them. And a few tutors who knew me were like, this is a big risk, because it's, you're leaving your area of modern history. My high school teachers were like, what are you doing? Sort of thing, But no, I had Professor Green. He really believed in me, which was great. And I managed to win a prize for the thesis, which was fantastic. So it was, it really allowed me to explore my other interests. And the reason I mentioned this is because it was during a class in my master's studies at Leeds. We were discussing the purpose of historians and the role of historians in this sort of seminar. And everyone was talking about specialising and specialists and this sort of thing. And I sort of whipped out this quote and I read it out, and the class was sort of, some of few eyes sort of widened, because they'd never heard this sort of possibility that there was another way to approach history. So I'll read it for you now for your sort of viewers, and hopefully you'll find it just as sort of inspiring as I do. He says, this is historical essays from the 1950s. So he says, today most professional historians specialise. They choose a period, sometimes a very brief period, and within that period they strive in desperate competition with ever-expanding evidence to know all the facts. Thus armed, they can comfortably shoot down any amateurs who blunder or rivals who stray into their heavily fortified field. And of course, knowing the strength of modern defensive weapons, they themselves keep prudently within their own frontiers. Theirs is a static world. They have a self-contained economy, a Maginot Line, and large reserves which they seldom use, but they have no philosophy. For a historical philosophy is incompatible with such narrow frontiers. It must apply to humanity in any period. To test it, a historian must dare to travel abroad, even in hostile country. To express it, he must be ready to write essays, even on subjects on which he may be ill-qualified to write books. And so that is a really powerful passage, I think, and it's something, as I say, which I've always sort of had in the back of my mind, but I'd never really saw it sort of outlined in that way. But of course, Hugh Trevor Roper's master of sort of historical prose, so I couldn't put it as well as that. But yeah, this is not to say that specialists aren't any good. I mean, I really admire specialist historians. I mean, I think they're fantastic. Their knowledge is incredible, because some people are just really interested in particular aspects of history, and that's great, and that's fine, and that's necessary as well. But for me, I like to explore all different things. And the point about traveling as well is particularly illuminating for me as well.
Look, one of the things that I know I've certainly been looking forward to speaking to you about is the subject of this book, which arrived this morning. And I'm very much looking forward to having a read at it. And this is a subject of research that you carried out as an undergraduate when you were studying history for your BA, and it's around the circumstances of the death of Adolf Hitler. And from what I know, you've been able to look at British intelligence and American intelligence documents. But I guess moving on from that, what I want to ask you is, why is it today that a work such as this is even needed? Why do so many people, and there are so many people out there, genuinely believe to this day that Adolf Hitler survived the Second World War and was able to flee Germany? Why is that?
Well, this is a really old story, and I guess this is a point which I sort of make to conspiracy theorists now, is that a lot of their ideas are recycled from the 1940s and 50s. So it really got going in 1945 when Stalin suggested that Hitler could have escaped for his own political reasons, and this inspired all sorts of rumors. So it's from that point when Stalin says, "Oh, Hitler might be in Spain, he might be in Argentina." You get the FBI officers and British intelligence. They have rumors of Hitler's survival popping up all over the place. Because I think because the Soviet government has given them legitimacy, it's sort of sparked the idea that this could have happened. Where's Hitler's body, sort of thing. Although they did have Hitler's body at the time. And what I do is I explore in the book, and very kind of British and American intelligence officers to have done this for me, but they looked into these rumors increasingly not because they thought Hitler had survived, because they had evidence that he was dead, but because they wanted to know why people were spreading the rumors, and they wanted to disprove them as well. So they found a sort of set of recurring motives. You had the political reasons, so Stalin was one of them, very, very likely done for political reasons. Neo-Nazi groups in Germany then latched on to this idea that the Führer could still be alive, because this will inspire the sort of Hitler youth to keep going with the old ideas of Nazism. There was even an attempt to sort of discredit Perón in Argentina by drawing attention to other Nazis that he might be helping to harbour. And that was in the FBI files in the book. And then you have individual citizens who do it for a range of reasons. There was pranksters, hoaxers. There was one chap in the FBI files that wanted to read out a false statement from Hitler on the radio just to cause alarm. And the FBI are actually investigating this stuff. And then there was personal vendettas. So people that just didn't like the neighbour that wanted to say he was Hitler so that they couldn't get in trouble. And that's interesting because that's similar to what the Gestapo actually experienced in Nazi Germany. If you look at the Gestapo files, a lot of the sort of denunciations were done out of personal spite. So that's not a really new thing if you look into intelligence files and motivations for false accusations. But then you had journalists. I mean, it was a big story. Journalists wanted to make money and to get notoriety. You had people that wanted to make themselves useful and make money and work in intelligence. So they'd say to the FBI, "Oh, I know where Hitler is. Work with me, and we'll help find him," sort of thing. But the key point is that in none of this is there any real evidence of Hitler having survived the Second World War. There is this recurring set of motives, and now, of course, that's the reason why people spread them. Whether some of these journalists actually believe it is a different kettle of fish, and it's obviously somewhat hard to speculate about because you don't want to put thoughts into other people's minds, if you like. But from the 40s and 50s, the reason why members of the general public might believe it is because the media is saying it. So you've got magazines, newspapers, they're printing these stories completely out of context of at the time what were secret files. So I suppose they could be more forgiven, if you like, in the 40s and 50s for it, because they don't have access to the MI5 files, and Stalin has said they don't have Hitler's body, so the press is just playing the game, if you like, at that time. But now, in the present day, it's more. I think it's more serious, because what happened was in 2009, there was a piece of skull in archives in Moscow, which they tested with DNA, and the DNA tests apparently said that it was a woman, so it couldn't have been Hitler. And this inspired a new sort of wave of conspiracy theories, books, and even a film, Grey Wolf, Escape Man of Hitler. And academic historians didn't really address this in much detail. They just sort of dismissed it as silly and said this is nonsense because we have evidence of Hitler here, but they didn't really go in for the arguments in a sort of forensic fashion, if you like. So this allowed them to spread, in my opinion, and then you just had a spiral of more books, more magazines, more internet pages, more sort of articles, and it reached a crescendo with the Hunting Hitler series on the TV. So you had 3 seasons of this program called Hunting Hitler. And why that's bad is because they tell an outright lie on episode 1. They say that there's nothing to back up the story of Hitler's suicide in the bunker. And it's complete nonsense, because there's loads of eyewitness testimony, there's documentary evidence which corroborates the eyewitness testimony, and then there's forensic evidence as well. And it's not just the forensic evidence of what's in Moscow. It's photographic evidence of the blood on Hitler's sofa, which they tested, and they found that it was Hitler's blood group. Hunting Hitler just ignores this, and I say it lies about history. And so people believe it, and people tend to believe it because they watch television. A lot of people don't read books, or they don't have time to read books, or they don't find academic books interesting, which is fine. But the problem with this is that when you have people on TV saying things as if they are fact and they're presented as experts, then people start to believe it. And then they start to tweet about it on Twitter and social media. They start to say it's fact. Look, history's been disproved. Hitler escaped to Argentina. Historians were wrong, which puts sort of historians into which questions the sort of credibility of historians, which is not good at all. And so this really inspired the book. I mean, this is partly why the book came out, because it was enough. It was time to put a stop to it before the potentially harmful consequences of these conspiracy theories were allowed to spread further. But the reason that people believe them is because they're given such a platform, and then they just spread on social media as well.
And just lastly, before we finish off, I'm just curious to know, if you were to give a young person, for example, any advice if they were looking to pursue a career that was in some way related to history, what would you say to them?
I'd say it's really hard work, and one of the key things that you've got to do is you've got to be a good reader, because you can't be a good writer if you're not a good reader. Because if you can't read well, then you can't engage with the arguments. You need to read broadly as possible, and you need to really sort of engage as much as you can with that existing literature before you put your own sort of argument out there. Travel as much as you can. If you're able to travel, I would say travel, and I don't mean go to the beach and things like this. I mean travel to museums and travel to historical sites, and do this outside of areas that you might be interested in. Do it outside of your what you might view as your specialism, because it informs your writing. If you travel, it informs your perspective that you have when you write. So what I did in my undergraduate degree at university, in my BA, I went on what I called my undergrad grand tour. So I saved up a lot of my student loan, which I had at the time, and I used it to travel around Europe. And I went to places like, I went to capitals. So I went Berlin, Vienna, Athens, Rome. And when I was there, I went and looked at all the sites and all the museums, and students can get discount in these places as well. So it's fantastic. I mean, a lot of the places I got in for free, because you're at a university, you've got your student card, you get in for free. And it's incredible. And the food there is cheap as well. So you'll love the food in Europe. And I'm saying Europe because I did modern European history was sort of my interest area. But of course, you travel wider if you like, America and places like this, if you can, budget allowing. But it was great for budget travel in Europe at university. The student loan will stretch to it if you sort of if you save and you sort of skimp on other things to get that travel. And it informed my essays at undergrad level as well, because when we had seminar discussions and things like this, I could add to the discussion in a way that perhaps other students mightn't be able to, because I remembered things from museums and I remembered things from sites, and actually being there and smelling it and seeing it and being able to think in your head, when you're writing Hitler's death, how far away is the bunker from the Reichstag, and how far is it from Brandenburg Gate? It makes a difference to your writing, because it's sort of like it weds your experience to the past in a more tangible way. I think that's how I put it. And the final point I'd say, I sort of paraphrased in the point about reading widely. One of my favourite authors, who's Christopher Hitchens, and he's a journalist, but he sadly passed away. But he writes about history as well. He's got a really good book on Anglo-American relations, and he used to teach. And I always remember a talk that he gave, and he was talking about writing in class and what it takes to be a good writer, and how he thinks he knows who's going to be a good writer and who's not going to be a good writer. And he'd ask the class, he'd say to them, hands up who writes because they feel like they enjoy it, hands up who writes because they want to, or hands up there. And then he would say, who writes because they feel like they have to? And he said, there was always one student in the class that'd look up and their eyes would catch, because it's like they feel the compulsion that this is something that they have to do. They don't do it just because they want to, they like it, they may do, but they do it because they feel that they have to. And it's that sort of drive and that sort of feeling that you have something to say, which will allow you to overcome the obstacles that you will face, because there will probably be obstacles. And people who say your ideas aren't good enough, this can't be published, you need to revise that and do this. But if you have that drive and you feel like that you have something to say, you can overcome them much easier, because you feel like you're doing what you have to do and what you're good at. And that's a way to sort of think about the setbacks, I think.